During today's exercise, we'll be learning about the mock unit testing framework in .NET. Before beginning today's exercise, you'll want to install .NET 5.0 and Visual Studio. In particular, I'll be using Visual Studio 2022 Community Edition Preview. To start, let's make a mock unit test directory that we can play in. Our goal is to learn how to use the mock testing framework. So in order to bootstrap that effort, we'll pull down the clean architecture repository and we'll move that source directory within it over to our play directory today. So link for that in the exercise and the description below. Now we can play. We can create a new solution. We'll do that with .NET new solution. We'll do that in the root directory. That's just an empty solution at this point. So we want to add our source project to that. So .NET solution add source.csproj. The reason we need a solution is because we'll be playing in Visual Studio, which plays more naturally with solution files at this point. We want to create a test project. That's where we're going to do our mock testing. So to do that, we'll do a .NET new ms test. We'll output that to test. So that's its own directory. It'll be test.csproj. That test project should also be added to the solution. So we'll do .NET solution add test.csproj. Now that's also in the solution. And we want to make sure that that test project depends on the source project so that we have something that we can actually test. It needs to be referencing it. So we'll run .NET add. We'll specify the project we're adding. We're going to add a reference to the source project. All right, so now test knows about source. That's good. And then finally, we want to add the mock package. So that's how we use the mock testing framework. We'll do .NET add test.csproj package MOQ. And that will run through and add that package. With all of that done, we're ready to open Visual Studio. In particular, we'll open up this file directory. So we can open a project, run through, open our solution. Over in Visual Studio, let's open up the test project, and within it, let's open up unit test1.cs. This is going to be where we're writing our test today. We're going to be writing tests to cover a specific core service. In this case, that's contact service. We wouldn't typically need to test an interface, and the infrastructure code isn't what we'll be testing with unit tests. Typically, you would cover that with integration tests or some sort of black box API testing. In this case, just contact service. And so within that, there's a few different things that you might test. In particular, let's verify that the create method will throw an invalid operation exception if the input entity is null. All right, remember what we've covered in previous exercises, we should rename our method to something that actually demonstrates in advance or summarizes what our goals are. Our goal is to verify that the contact service create method will throw an invalid exception for a null input. So let's name it as such. Contact service create throws invalid operation exception for null input. That's it. That's our name. We get to leverage a part of the unit testing framework. We're not yet at the point of mock, but in the unit testing framework, there's an attribute you can use for when you expect an exception. So we'll leverage that here. I'm going to say we expect an exception. Great. It's trying to help me already, which is nice. Type of, and it's an invalid operation exception. I don't have system in a using declaration yet, so I have to add that. And voila. If I don't get an invalid operation exception, you also have to close your parentheses there. If I don't get an invalid operation exception, this test should fail. And we can verify that now. If I run it, it builds, and then it failed. We expected to have an invalid operation exception. Let's navigate into the Test Explorer. That's View Test Explorer to see more about that. This also allows you to drill down into a specific class, specific test, and identify what went wrong. And in this case, test method did not throw the expected exception. Let's start out that arrange act assert organization. I like to do that via comments to help visualize. And then assert. Excellent. In the arrange step, we'll be creating our repository and our service. We need to create a repository because we need it for the service. We can see that quickly. If we do that, it'll say, hey, you don't have this dependency declared, so let's add a using declaration here. And then in order to do that, you need to have an implementation of the iContact repository. So we should create a repository. In order to do that, I need to create a new contact repository instance. That requires me to know about the infrastructure dependency, that namespace. If you have that in a different project, you need to add that project. Then we'll need to inject that implementation or that instance of a repository into the contact service that we're newing up. That's its dependency. And then finally, we need some input, so we're going to arrange the input. For create, we need an instance of a contact. So we're going to create a new contact. In fact, we want to test if it's null, so we can't use var here. We have to specify. We have a contact, which is null. Then for act, we're just going to call service.create with that contact. Write some space in there. The assert is actually handled by the exception. So in this case, I have nothing to add for the assert. And if we were to run this, we should expect that it will pass now. And it does. Now, remembering that a unit test is intended to cover a single unit of work. And the repository in the infrastructure namespace is an implementation of a behavior of a data access layer in this case. And in a full implementation, that might actually connect to a database. And leveraging the actual implementation might implement a change or a call to the database that could be a write, could alter state. And that isn't really a unit test anymore. It becomes closer to like an integration test. And it's also not particularly fast. I mean, contacting a database can be a pretty slow thing sometimes compared to just the millisecond it might take otherwise, a few milliseconds to just call a service, call some code. So we generally don't want to create this dependency. And the way we get around that is we use mock. So because we ran that add package before, we now have using mock as an option. And if we say new mock of iContact repository, then we no longer need the infrastructure dependency here. We have the declaration moved to mock. And now we have a mock to repository that we can just say, hey, give me an instance of an object that is that mocked repository. And that'll work just as well. And if I run this again, it should pass. Voila. It's working. So it's neat that we got rid of the dependency on an implementation of this repository. But we do know still these methods will end up calling that repository object, and so we might expect some behavior to happen in the method and react based off that. Or we might instead need to verify that the output is what we would expect for a given input, and we can mock up what that might look like. For the immediate, let's verify that for a given input string, we're actually returning an object from the repository. Let's go back into the unit test. We're going to create a new method to do that. All right, so we're going to make sure that contact service is returning a contact from the repository in its retrieve call. In order to start that process, we can actually leverage this part. That's pretty universal in each of these methods. In fact, we could actually make that on construction of this unit test so that it happens universally. For the immediate, we'll just keep it per method. And then we can go further. We can say, hey, for a given contact name. We'll say maybe Pete. We might have an expected output. So we'll need to know the expected contact that is output when we do this. That will be a contact, and we'll say, hey, the name is hey, it knows what I want. They're getting smarter. The number will be some number. The type will be a person. Now we know we expect to have a contact. We have a service implement. We're ready there. Let's use one of Mock's interesting behaviors that we can play with. We'll call the repository. Now this is a mocked object yet. We don't have we're not caring about this specific implementation, but we're going to call this mock, and we'll say, hey, let's set up that if somebody calls the retrieve method with the contact name, then let's go ahead and return the expected contact. That's great. The act is pretty simple. We're just going to be verifying that we have an actual contact that we retrieve from the service.retrieve, and we'll pass in the contact name. So we should expect when we pass in a contact name, Pete, we retrieve the object that we expect. That's great. And then the assert, we're going to have assert.isNotNull, for instance. So we should expect this came back and is not null. That's a great first check. And further, we might say are equal. And we don't have the comparison implementation here, so we can do that per property. So .name, maybe .number and .type are also fair to test. And when we run it, it works, which is great. Now we know that the name, number, and type are all returning as we expect. Note that this is working on a very specific input contact name. If that's not really interesting to us, we can just remove that. We can say, hey, this is Pete directly now. And we can say, just when we retrieve just any string, we can say it.is any string, it being a mock framework tool that we get. We can say just it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant what we're inputting there or what is being input in there by the class. We just want to retrieve the expected contact so long as a string is being thrown into that method. And then we can expect that if we input, expected contact.name into the act, that it still is working. It's the expected contact's being returned. The actual contact should be the expected contact. And it passes. So we have this ability to say whatever level of specificity as we might want, right? We can say, hey, this is not specific at all. This is just generically wide net. If there's a string thrown in there, behave that way. Or we can say, hey, very specific, we're passing in Pete. And if Pete is what you get, then return this. If Pete's not what you get, don't return this. And so you can have interesting levels of behavior that you're customizing now as a result of having that tool. Another thing you might want to verify is how many times the repository is actually being called. Suppose that you end up in a weird loop situation, that the repository ends up being called 5 times in the same method, and thus creating some sort of weird performance issue. That might be something you might want to unit test out, right? So the way that we do that here is actually on the repository mock object. We can verify, see, it's so smart, it's trying to help me. We can verify that when retrieve is called with any string, for instance, is any, that it should only be called once. And that would say, hey, this is only called once, therefore pass. If it's called more than once, or if it's called 0 times, then we should fail. If we run that, we should see it passes. And further, we should be able to say, hey, times.exactly, if this is called 3 times, right? We can say 3 times, and maybe that's the interesting number. But in this case, of course, it shouldn't be called 3 times, and thus it will fail. And if we, as I press random things, if we look over here, it says, hey, we expected exactly 3 times, but it was only 1 time. And this is what was called. So if instead we specified 1 or once again, we'd be happy. You'll note there's different ways you can use times here, so that's a pretty exciting thing. Further, you'll note you can specify message, fail message, so you can add some more customization to what information is being shown to you. Today we looked at the mock unit testing framework with C#. We learned how to run setup to adjust the behavior or set the expected behavior of a method. We learned how to remove specific implementation dependencies. We learned how to verify that methods were called a number of times. If you have additional time, you might check out some of the links below. There's a mock quick start that's offered by the team that made mock. It covers some other behaviors like mock behavior, which determines the strictness to which implementation has to be specified, what behavior is going to be performed. Or perhaps different levels of how to specify what's being input into a method. If you don't have that time, well, congrats on a non-zero day.